I'd like to talk a little bit about national parks. Before I taught this class, I thought if anything was in a national park, it would be protected. It would be there forever. But parks are ecological islands. And as we all know at this point in the course, ecological islands are impacted by things that happen outside their borders. But first, let's start with a little history. Yellowstone was America's first national park, and in fact, it was the world's first national park. And this is a painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone by Thomas Moran. It was created in 1872, and 1872 was the year that Yellowstone was established as a national park. The United States Congress established the National Park Protection Act in 1872, and that is when Yellowstone became America's and the world's first national park. And this act broke with the established policy of transferring public lands in the West to private ownership. But the idea was not conservation. The parks were to be monuments of nature, spectacular places to compete with the monuments in the cathedrals of Europe. And in fact, the last bison disappeared about 10 years after Yellowstone was established. The original parks were managed independently with different degrees of success by different organizations. And so in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson established the National Park Service to consolidate the management of America's parklands under one agency. And the National Park Service today manages 84 million acres across all U.S. states and territories, and has served as a model for countries around the world. And parks are managed according to the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916. And the act states that the fundamental purpose of the parks is to, quote, conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment in the same manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And so this concept of park management was to somehow manage the parks in a way to create an illusion of primitive America. But things have changed since the Organic Act of 1916. Parks are affected by factors that did not exist in pre-Columbian times. There's absence of natural fire regimes, both due to Smokey the Bear policies and now Holocaust fires because of fire suppression and climate change. There's problems with exotic species in many of the parks. There's diseases that affect wildlife and plants within the parks. Many of the parks lack their natural apex predators. Heavy visitation has been a problem for a number of years. Water quality and quantity, partly due to climate change. On the East Coast, acid rain is having a huge impact on some of the parks. Air pollution has a big impact on some of the parks. And then climate change is affecting all of the parks. If we look at climate change in Yellowstone, the temperatures in the park are higher now than they were 50 years ago, especially during the spring. And nighttime temperatures seem to be increasing more rapidly than daytime temperatures. The growing season, which is the time between the last freeze of spring and the first freeze of fall, has increased by 30 days in some areas of the park. And at the northeast entrance, there's 60 more days per year above freezing than there were in the mid-1980s. There are approximately 30 fewer days per year with snow on the ground than there were in the 1960s. Well, climate change is having a big impact on one of the iconic species of the park, and that is the grizzly bear. because the grizzly bear depends on the seeds that are found in the cones of whitebark pines before they go into hibernation. And this is a picture of a number of dead and dying whitebark pines. And what's happening is warmer temperatures have allowed mountain pine beetles to move up to higher elevations. Historically, whitebark pines, pine beetles were not an issue for whitebark pines because they were killed by cold temperatures. But with increasing temperatures, the season is warmer, and mountain pine beetles have had a huge impact, killing huge areas of whitebark pines. And that is going to have catastrophic consequences for grizzly bears that live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Because the typical diet of a grizzly bear, well, it varies from season to season. In the spring, as the snow is melting and carcasses emerge from the snow, the bears feed on winter-killed elk and bison. And then in the early summer, they feed on spawning cutthroat trout. And cutthroat trout have actually been impacted by climate change with warmer water temperatures, which are stressing them and reducing their populations. Then in the late summer, bears move to the high country to feed on moths, which feed on the nectar of alpine flowers. And then right before hibernation in the fall, they feed on the seeds of whitebark pines. Those seeds are large, they're nutrient rich, they're loaded with fat and protein, and they're needed for the bears to gain weight during hibernation. And so increased temperatures have resulted in increased mountain pine beetles at high elevations, which has resulted in large die-offs of whitebark pines, which decreases the fall food source for grizzly bears, which means that they're entering hibernation in poor condition and may not make it through hibernation. Another impact that parks are seeing is an absence of natural fire regimes. There's an increase in the length of the fire season due to climate change. There's an increase in the number of fires. There's an increase in the time needed to put out wildfires. And significantly more area is being burned in these fires lately. Another example of a fire in the West is the Rim Fire in Yellowstone. Not in Yellowstone, in Yosemite in 2013. The Rim Fire was California's third largest fire. It burned for 2 months. 255,000 acres were burned, and 77,254 of those acres were within the boundaries of Yosemite National Park. And this is a map that shows the fire history of Yosemite. And note that the bright pink, notice the little area indicated in bright pink that burned between 1930 and 1969. Compare that with the area that burned between 2010 and 2018, which is any area that you see in sort of the turquoise blue on this. And so a huge increase in area that has been burned by wildfires between 2010 and 2018 compared to 1930 to 1969. Exotic species are a problem in a number of parks. Perhaps the worst problem is in the Everglades. Burmese pythons have been introduced into the Everglades. They have no natural predators, and they are consuming endangered species. They are consuming birds. They are eliminating basically the mammals of the Everglades. In Anza Borrego, which is not a national park, it's actually a state park, but another example, this is also happening in all over the deserts of the Southwest, is an introduced mustard from Africa called Sahara mustard. And this Sahara mustard is very invasive, and it's actually choking out the native desert wildflowers. This is Joshua Tree National Park. And there is an introduced grass that does especially well in drought conditions called red brome grass. And you can see it growing between the Joshua trees. And not only does it compete for nutrients, but it also increases the probability of fire in an area that's not adapted to fire in Joshua Tree National Park. And then there's new diseases. Wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995. And by 1997, all of the wolves that were tested for disease had at least one infection. And those infections included canine distemper, canine parvovirus, and canine herpes virus. Okay. And then in 2007, wolves inside the park started testing positive for mange. And mange impacts animals that are stressed by other factors. And then there's the absence of natural predators. Earlier in the course, you saw this data from William Newmark's study of large animal extinction, large animal species and extinction rates in North American national parks. Notice Yosemite lost 25% of its original mammal species. Yosemite no longer has grizzly bears. Yosemite no longer has wolves. It's highly unlikely that wolverines exist in Yosemite today. And so a lot of the parks have lost a lot of their apex predators. Heavy visitor use is an issue, and it's becoming more and more of an issue as the areas around the parks become more urbanized. This is a picture actually that I took in Yellowstone in the 1980s, and this is actually the 1990s. This is a traffic jam going into Yellowstone, and the crowding is much worse today than it was in the 1990s. This is a picture of Old Faithful, and I was kind of amazed. Again, this is a picture from the 1990s. To see Old Faithful, you're packed in crowds like this, waiting for the geyser to go off. Climate change and pollution affects water quality and quantity. According to the National Park Service in Yellowstone, small lakes and ponds are already drying up, and they've had problems with cutthroat trout with increased water temperatures stressing the fish, and they've had to close the fishing season early a number of times. And of course, remember, cutthroat trout are a prime food item for grizzlies in the springtime. Air pollution is an issue. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon on a day with air pollution and on a day without pollution. There's a coal-fired power plant that exists in Page, Arizona. In Page, Arizona, outside the park, creating hazy days like this. And it's not only the coal plant in Page, Arizona, but it depends on the direction of the winds. The Grand Canyon gets polluted air from the south, from the southwest, and then even from Nevada, depending on the direction the wind is blowing. Acid rain is a problem, especially on the East Coast. Acid rain occurs when water in the atmosphere combines with pollution, which is created from burning coal, oil, gasoline, or other hydrocarbons. And acid rain affects the landscape in a number of ways. One of the things that happens is it leaches calcium from the soil, and that reduces nutrients that are available to plants. And it also causes eggshell defects in birds, which reduces reproduction in birds and can lead to a huge decline in bird populations. This is a picture in the Great Smoky Mountains of trees that died due to acid rain. Okay. Another picture of dying trees. And so, according to air quality experts, each year the amount of acid deposition of sulfur oxides in the Great Smokies is comparable to 200 railroad cars spilling sulfuric acid in the park. And this has had huge effects on the park's ecosystem. It's one of the most serious threats to the Smokies and other parks in the area.